All right, and we are ready to go. So, Joseph, Joey, nice to meet you, man. Been looking forward to this, and yeah, let's go ahead and talk about whatever we're going to be talking about. I know you got some things you wanted to bring up, so let's just dive right into it, I guess.
First of all, I was watching your channel before my channel ever existed, and because you're very distinct, there's no mistaking your voice. I think compared to Terrence McKenna by your own viewers, and whenever I read that comment, I was like, that's what it is. That's what's going on, and so listening to your channel is fantastic for being at work, and having something going on. The only problem with it is sometimes you'll go down a certain rabbit hole where you're like, shit, this is the part I want to actually pay attention to. And then people around you are just falling into ditches, and it's chaos because I was like, the other day I was just kind of laying on the couch and taking a nap, falling asleep, and I was listening to your video or whatever, and you were talking about like morphic resonance or whatever, and it was one of those things where I was drifting to sleep, and then you hit a point where I was just like, oh, okay, I'm awake, I'm awake, and because you've got a bit of wordiness to you that I don't have or whatever. So I'm over here like learning new words and shit, like listening to your channel. But your channel is very scholarly. It's one of those things where I think you could play it for a scientist and they would be on board. Whereas if they were to hear my channel, they'd be like, you know, this guy needs to go find a thesaurus or something like that. But
Well, yeah, it's like there's always like this thing where there's like always going to be a lot of people who are like, why can't you just like speak plain English? And then there's the other people who are like, if you mess up any detail, they're just gonna absolutely hammer you on it. And I'm kind of obsessive anyway, so I just kind of lean more in that direction regardless.
right. Well,
Um,
you gotta paint a picture, dude. And sometimes that requires, like, if you're reading Hume, for example, you're not gonna get away with everyday regular street talk. It ain't gonna come through. It ain't happening. So there's certain concepts that are so abstract that the words themselves are also gonna have to start to get abstract. And and by the way, to those people who criticize me for talking plain English, and then the different people will turn around and criticize you for being over articulate. The difference is what makes us each unique and comparable. That's what makes this whole damn thing fun in the first place. And if you think anybody is supposed to be more like someone else, you've completely missed the point. You know,
oh yeah, absolutely. And another thing though, like different kinds of language resonate with different kinds of people, you know what I mean? Like I use a lot of kind of like philosophical jargon and whatnot because I'm really trying to get through to the kind of people who are more inclined to not take this kind of thing seriously. You know what I mean? The more sciencey people, because like in my mind, I'm always like kind of writing these videos for like the 16-year-old version of me who was obsessed with reading like Richard Dawkins and stuff like that. And I'm just like, if I was going to convince that person, what would I say?
right?
And the thing is, a lot of it's kind of languaging too, because like back, if we go back to prior to the modern era, there wasn't really a need for any kind of technical terminology because like the ordinary language itself kind of already had this stuff built in. So like the ancient Greeks, for example, when they used a word like fire, um, that it wasn't just like the combustion that happens when you rub two sticks together, right? Like they were referring to this like really overarching archetypal concept that included like the celestial realm and the like idea of psyche and the abstract and the idea of will, like it was all just packed into that word fire. And we don't really have that anymore. When we think fire, we're just like, oh, that's, what happens when you rub two sticks together. And same thing with like water, we think of water as like, oh, water is H2O. Well,
Dude,
like, yeah, it is, but water's also blood. Water's also rain. Water is also vitality, and it's a very
it,
broad
it,
type of thing.
yeah, it is raw, and we pack a lot into words as symbols and stuff, and I like the way the Greeks did it with having multiple words for the different kinds of love, because we just use the word love. And if you use the wrong word love in Greek, you're going to be talking about the wrong person in the wrong way, and it's going to be bad. But for example, fire. The way you're describing the word fire being known to the average American as rubbing two sticks together and it's a flame. If that is your overarching reach of what fire means, we're going to have issues in communication. And I'm glad you said that because, some of my viewers like to know that me and you have a little bit of something in common. That is, we love to bitch about the comments. Now, let me reiterate. I love the comment section and I love my community. But when I go live after a video, my audience is almost anticipating that I got something to bitch about. And so I just released Sons of Alchemy, where in the video, and I'm going to try to be verbatim, I say something about the inner fire within, the inner soul, or whatever it was. And I refer to the alchemical symbol of the sun being an isolated and everlasting entity, something that never is born and never can die. Oh my goodness, it was just one. It wasn't several, it was one person. The sun was born, it had a beginning and it will die. In billions of years, the sun will be gone. What kind of nonsense is this? And I'm just like, bro, I can't just hold your hand through this whole thing. Like, you know, the
That's my
alchemical symbol,
job. That's my job. So
right?
walk them through step by step.
Certain things that we don't have words for because words won't do it. So it requires a symbol like the alchemical sun to, because the sun seems to, the psyche, the primordial man, it seems to be immortal. The moon comes and goes, right? That's our flesh. It dies and it's rebirth, like plants, like winter, like the planet, like everything. Whereas the sun is always, always there. It never wanes. That makes it to the psyche a perfect symbol for the eternal soul. And some people just can't, they can't put it in there. One of the comments someone I posted, because I went on this long spiel about Mars always being personified as a god of war, the conqueror, right? And then later in the video, not much later in the video either, I mentioned that Cairo, in Egypt, the word Cairo seems to mean Mars. I got a comment and they corrected the fuck out of me. They were like, I'll have you know, Cairo is not even an Egyptian word. It doesn't mean Mars. It means he who conquers through war. I'm like, just, okay. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your input.
Yeah, you mentioned the sun though. That's a really interesting thing because the alchemical symbol for the sun, it's also an eye, which is
Right.
right. It's like the circle and the dot in the middle, right? And so there's something really interesting going on there. I've been like on this huge Rudolf Steiner kick for a long time, and he's constantly talking about the eye, like capital I. But it's also like that, like an eyeball too, right? Like there's this whole thing with the sense of selfhood itself is somehow contained within the archetype of the sun. And then with what you were talking about with alchemy, then there's also this connection with the heart, right? Like there and the chakras and whatnot. There's somehow this idea within that kind of like Christian esoteric tradition of like the human eye, like the human sense of self or subjectivity, being transformed literally by the blood. Like the heart transforms, and then that changes the blood in some way, and then that moves up into the skull, and then has this kind of transformative power, like literally for the human head. Like there's something that's going on there, and in this kind of like subtle uh sort of way, and you actually see that like within Christianity, like the crucifixion of Jesus happens on Calvary or Golgotha. Both of those words mean skull. And then like you've got this mythology of like the skull of Adam being underneath the place of the crucifixion, and so the blood goes down into the skull, and so there's all this crazy stuff going on with like the symbolism and how it relates to like the relationship between like literally different physiological aspects of the human body and these transformations of consciousness which are supposed to be occurring. So yeah, all kinds of cool stuff to talk about there for sure.
The eye is perfect uh, for that symbol. And one thing that I've always wondered and then kind of maybe came upon an epiphany for was like Alex Gray artwork has eyes on every surface. And if you do DMT, these entities are going to come at you and they're completely made out of eyes. And then you see the archetypal symbol of the eye of Horus and the eye, well, the all-seeing eye, the dot within the circle. And you kind of realize that if consciousness is meant to be symbolized to a viewer who is doesn't know any better, let's say a human being, and there's a higher consciousness that wants to communicate with the human being, you can't appear to them as an ear or even a living brain. The human will just see body parts. But when they see an eye, there's something happens. We're like, that's on, that's alive and aware of itself, and it's trying to tell me something, and it's freaking me out, man. Like the eye is certainly what does that, and I guess that makes it no surprise that all of this mythology and symbolism of the skull, because we go into the caves and it gives us this almost sense of being that person inside of our own skull, like it almost feels like we're in here. I know that's the wrong way to put it because there's a lot of traditions that believe that the center is within the heart, but to modern man, it feels and seems like maybe that's just part of the yuga we're in, but it seems like we're in here driving around or whatever, you know.
So, so check this out. What happens if you look at earlier, let's say, I don't want to use the word more primitive because everybody's going to get on my case about that. But if you look back to like shamanic or animistic cultures, all right, technical difficulties. Anyway, what was I on about? Yeah, okay. So yeah, so if we look back to like shamanic and animistic cultures, they describe the sense of self as being localized in like the guts, in the viscera. And then as we kind of move into more civilization era type peoples, it moves upward. It kind of moves through the chakras. They'll say that they feel the sense of self within the heart or even the lungs. It's actually very common for it to be experienced as being in the lungs because that's where the breath of life is, right? And then it's really when we start to move into the late Roman period that this sense of being like behind the eyeballs somewhere starts to really come into play. And it's interesting because you actually see this in the Roman sculptures, like their statues and busts. They started drilling holes into the eyes of the sculptures to represent the pupils, whereas before it was just painted on. Because what's happening is they're starting to conceptualize the eye as like a doorway into a subjective interiority. The ancient Greeks did not think like that. They did not have a conception of subjective interiority, right? And for them, like consciousness was just kind of distributed. There wasn't really a division between the purely subjective and the purely objective. But in the late Roman period, we're starting to see the early iterations of that, because what's happening here is the Christ event is reshaping human consciousness. And we see it play out historically leading up to the Italian Renaissance. And by the time we get to the Renaissance, then it's fully interiorized. And you can see this in the Renaissance art, because if you compare like medieval and Renaissance art, and medieval art, it's all like it looks two-dimensional to us, right? Because it's all like just there's no perspective to it. But once you get to the Renaissance, then like if you look at like the painting of the Last Supper or the Mona Lisa or anything like that, what those artists are doing is they're using the form of the art itself to implicate this idea of like a space that's like extending out through the painting, almost like the painting itself is a kind of window, right? So if you look at these old like mosaics from the Middle Ages or the Roman period, they're not looking at you, the viewer. Like they're just kind of like gazing off into to nowhere. But then you look at the Mona Lisa, she's looking at you, right? Like, and so there's this
Yeah.
indication there of the subjectivity, the experience of the viewer is being
Right.
indicated within the art itself. And so what's happening here throughout this whole process is the human sense of selfhood. It's moving upward, like literally through the body up into the skull, and then it's kind of receding into this interior space, which is represented by the human skull, which is kind of like a cavern. It is this dark interior world, and we start to feel our consciousness as something that has this kind of boundary that separates us from the world. And then we start to see that expressed in philosophy after the Renaissance with figures like Descartes and Kant. So you've got this process that's occurring going all the way across at least 2,000 years of history, probably tens of thousands of years, of the human self, the human sense of I being generated really by this historical development.
It's happening to everyone all at once. And that's what's crazy is what I didn't really think about this until, I mean, until you just said it. It would be normal to think of like an individual person or an individual society was making these changes of center of self moving up for whatever reason. And but to think about that it's happening to the entire earth simultaneously as what the earth is going through these changes, I suppose, then we are too. That is staggering to me. And that kind of reminds me of Rupert Sheldrake and what he talks about with whenever a change occurs to me, a change occurs to you simultaneously, which actually me and you aren't that far apart. But so in Japan, the changes will also occur there. If we start learning something new here, it'll be easier for them over there. And the concept of the sense of I going from the gut to the lungs, and then it makes me wonder if it's ever occurred to people to be in the throat, because now I'm thinking chakras at this point. But then inevitably to have us now think that we are in here now behind the eyes and the head. It's almost difficult to conceptualize being an Egyptian person and feeling yourself as being in the heart center, or the Aboriginal Australians or whatever, where they feel like they were in the gut bacteria, which isn't that far fetched considering the gut bacteria controls a lot of our behaviors. So it's almost like an as above, so below thing going on where we're moving up. And I wonder if it's going to kind of come back down. But how do you think that this works where it affects the entire peoples on the entire globe, almost like we are like a moss or a mold on the planet?
So yeah, is it gonna keep going up or is it gonna change directions? This is an interesting question. I don't know really, but if you look at the Indic traditions, the third eye chakra is what would really correspond to this kind of what I've called perspectival consciousness. Um, but then beyond that, then you've got the crown chakra, which is located, yeah, there we go, uh, at the vertex at the top of the head.
Yeah.
um, I don't know, man. I've never felt myself to be at the top of my head, frankly. I don't know what that would feel like. So I don't know. Maybe that's just their way of visually conceptualizing it, or maybe that is like a mode that we could get into at some point. I'm not entirely sure. It kind of makes sense to me though that it would be the other way, that like after it gets to the top, like behind the eyeballs, that eventually it would like change and go back down. Like I can see that happening too, but honestly, I have no idea. What I do know is this: we've gone through 500 years of, well, really longer than that. It depends on where you're counting from, but we've been within that behind the eyeballs type consciousness, perspectival consciousness for a while now. And we're moving into something different right now. We're moving into whatever the next phase is. And you can see it like the groundwork for that transformation being laid going all the way back to the late 18th century at least. Um, and there's the possibility of a new kind of consciousness coming into play, right? Because the big problem with that behind the eyeballs perspectival consciousness is that once you lose contact with the other layers of the human self, then you end up in this really awkward position where you end up in this basically solipsism, where it's like, oh, wait, what if my consciousness is all that exists? Because you start to feel like there's this like boundary between you and the world, and then like all you have access to is your subjective experience of the world, and you start to feel like you're locked inside of this kind of prison almost, really. Like, and people who do psychedelics, they had this is like part of the breakthrough that usually happens, right? Like when you get sucked into the like hell world part, they'll describe it this way, like they feel like they're trapped. And then once they finally let go, that's when they break through the other side and things stop being so hellish. That's where we're at as a planet right now. I think we're at that phase where we're like really sucked into our own egos, in such a way that we're basically in this kind of relativistic solipsism where like nothing seems true, nothing seems real, everything just feels like purely subjective. We feel like we're these isolated little atoms, but we know that there are all these other little atoms out there that have their own opinions and views on things. And so everything just feels like meaningless. And but the thing is, though, that's become so acute that people are starting to realize, like, okay, there's got to be something else, and that's part of the process too. I think that's what we're moving through right now, actually.
Absolutely. It's a claustrophobia. And
Yeah.
you can't be in that little cave for very long without freaking out. And it is difficult to wonder if it cycles to the top and then comes back down, because every single near death experience has one thing in common. The consciousness is above the head, and it's looking down at the person. It's also looking down at the car accident or the surgery table and the doctors and people in the room. Imagine how much we could cure this global solipsism and claustrophobia, so to speak, if everyone was, in a way, looking down on themselves and each other and realizing, oh, okay, I'm not necessarily me or that. They might realize after looking at themselves from up here, say, there's no such thing as an island or an identity. The reason that we have an identity is because another identity differs from ours. So there's no self all of a sudden. I mean, you can have a self, you can have an ego, and those are healthy things. It helps us survive, of course. But if you realize the only reason that you are who you are is because I am not, you realize that, oh, I utterly depend on this person to be my opposite. Why would I ever be angry with this person who is my opposite? You know, whenever you see this facade, I'll call it a circus of politics, where these people have a color and these people have a color and they're opposite and they're fighting. They should look at each other and say, thank you for being the opposite of me, because it gives me the opportunity to literally be something. Otherwise, if you were to political people, let's say these political people want to get rid of this entire group, and let's say it works and they're gone now. Now, all that there is your group. Guess what's going to happen, bitch? It's going to draw a line right down the center. If you cut off the left side of the room by putting up a wall, now my room is only right side. You're going to blink twice, and now guess what? Your room has a new left. You know, we completely depend on that, and that's why I think that people should work on moving their consciousness up and down through these centers. And I know chakras is a buzzword, whatever, but that's the word that, energy centers, you can pick your own if you want, nodes, but if you're stuck right here in this little cave up here, you're not going to realize all those other bits of consciousness until all of a sudden one day your gut starts to ache and you're getting this feeling, and then your heart's broken and you're like, oh God, why is that? And then you're trying to analyze all of this consciousness by putting this one into overdrive. Oh my goodness, you're gonna run in circles until you're exhausted, and by the way, I'm guilty of that. You can't think your way out of any sort of issues, and that's kind of that meditation. I think is whenever you do a meditation, which you can't do wrong, you're still gonna start to expand your consciousness, not only in the upward direction but in a downward direction. You're gonna start to recognize all this that's going on right here and be like, oh, that's me too. And then once this is you too, you might look outwards to your opposite person and say, oh, that's also me as well. Everything that I'm looking at is an extension of me. Therefore, you can kind of merge. And if it's a dangerous concept though, because if you merge too much, all of a sudden you've got an overactive empathy, and that hurts. Or maybe you don't have enough anxiety of ego to be able to keep up with everyday life and bills, or what they might call the dharma. You got to have one foot in the grave, and you got to have one foot in the spiritual. And that's where I think, and that goes with the opposites too, is that there's people who are spiritual and there's people who think that all that stuff is nonsense, right? And there's friction here. And meanwhile, it takes, people like you and I who realize that, oh, if you have a foot in each thing, you're going to be walking the center path, and that's what's, I think, it is healthy. That's the healthy spot to kind of stick in. And you can waver in one direction or the other, kind of make that sine wave with your identity, with that consciousness. And it's fun to toy with, it's fun to, I dare I say, define, and then toy with, and you get to play with it. And it makes that claustrophobia of solipsism go away. And it's the best thing I think a person can do for themselves.
Yeah, well, several things about this. So, well, first of all, you can't have half a magnet, right? You cut it in half, you just get two magnets, right? And so that reminds me of another thing. Carl Jung, people love talking about shadow projection. which I've almost like completely stopped talking about that because I've seen so many people like arguing online and they'll just be like, oh, you're just doing shadow projection. They just kind of like try to psychoanalyze whoever they're arguing with into being wrong, which is just like whatever. And anyway, but if you actually read Carl Jung, the way he talks about this shadow projection, what you're actually doing, the purpose of it is that you're actually kind of using another person as a mirror in a way, and you're seeing aspects of yourself which are not properly integrated into yourself, your ego. That performs a role within our individuation process because then that forces us to actually come into conflict with things about ourselves that we're running from effectively. Um, Now, with regards to that kind of solipsism we were talking about, and feeling like we're just locked inside our skull somewhere between our eyeballs, there's a very real potential for psychosis within this. One of Descartes' biographers has argued that he was probably a paranoid schizophrenic, and I think this is really interesting because that's something that occurred to me a long time ago, and I thought I was just speculating, but apparently there's actually some good textual evidence that that's actually true. So Descartes significant here because Descartes the I think therefore I am, right? He's the guy who starts trying to rebuild philosophy by doubting everything. And then what's he doing? He's kind of receding back into his own mind until he can find the thing that is certain. And the thing that is certain is the I think, therefore I am, the source of doubt itself, the source of paranoia itself, becomes the center of certainty for Descartes. And so, yeah, I mean, there's absolutely something very adjacent to paranoid schizophrenia within that. Because if you really start thinking in that way and really start believing it, like, oh, maybe nothing's real, maybe it's all just my consciousness. I mean, that can get really ugly. I mean, like that's no joke. I mean, I know people who have been like actually hospitalized from falling into like loops like that. So yeah, that's no joke. But so what happens a lot of times, especially with the more spiritualistic communities, is this tendency of kind of demonizing the ego because of that. And so what'll happen is they'll be like, oh, you just got to do a bunch of shrooms and kill your ego, meditate until your ego goes away, man. It's your ego. Your ego is the only thing keeping your dumbass alive. Like it's literally because what it is, it's really the sense of boundary between self and world. You can't walk around all day in ego death. You'll die. You need an ego. But at the same time, what needs to happen is the ego needs to be properly integrated. All these because what happens is that if the ego is what you think you're referring to when you use the word I, and you think that that word is just referring to some little pinprick of light behind your eyeballs, there's all this other stuff that's not being included in that. And so so meditation practices, for example, are a great way of kind of reincorporating these other layers, which is really important for I mean like mental health, physiological health. I mean, we have no idea the degree to which these things can affect like our bodies and illnesses and things like that. But I mean, there has to be innumerable ways in which that is the case, and we know that just by looking at the placebo effect. We know that there's this interlinking of the psychological and the somatic. So yeah, there is kind of a middle path here, I would say, but because just pure, annihilating your ego completely is just not an option. That's not good. But at the same time, falling into that purely solipsistic way of thinking is just as dangerous for comparable reasons.
It reminds me of the Zen masters who they would kind of have they had ego death, right? But once that ego death was in place, they could look down at their body and the other bodies and everything. It's almost like a video game, right? So, it's like they were playing their own character and they could move their own character and have it speak and stuff, but they were aware that they were not that, but they still had full control. And there's, so people do recommend, they'll be like, oh, dude, 5 grams in silent darkness. And you got me over here being a real stick in the mud. I'm like, no. I mean, yes, but don't just jump into that. It's not safe. Work your way up if you want. But there's ways, as you had just mentioned, multiple ways to do that. And meditation is a slow way. Psychedelics are a fast way. It might be too fast, though. That's why I love the Wim Hof method, his breathing exercises, dude. If you, every single morning, I used to do it because in construction, it's very cold sometimes. And the Wim Hof method makes you immune to cold. And that's
Oh, wow.
just that. It doesn't cost any money, so you're not going to really hear about it. But if you do the Wim Hof method and you go hard with it, whenever you get to that exhale and then you hold on that exhale, I'll be damned if all of a sudden your center of consciousness, you'll find it in your fingertips. You'll find it in your gut. It's really weird, and it's a perfect little middle ground where you can experience that ego death or movement of center of ego, at least, and then be able to snap out of it. Unlike somebody might do LSD and now they're trapped for 10 hours as a cicada in the rain. And it's a really ugly experience, and I'll never do that again. But you can experience the ego death safely with yogic practices. It's that the Wim Hof method has really taught me a lot about myself, because after I'm holding on the exhale, and I kind of do myself a psychological trick on myself. Instead of trying to force myself to have no thought, I'll ask myself the question, I wonder what my next thought will be. And my brain trips over that notion. And all of a sudden I get a couple seconds where it's blank, because I'm inviting a thought in. And just like trying to think of an actor's name who was in that movie and you just can't think of it, and the harder you think of the actor's name, it won't come to you. And then you stop thinking about it 5 minutes later. You're like, oh, that was Mark Ruffalo. That's what I think either, meditation or the Wim Hof method does, especially if you invite those thoughts in and you watch them go by. And as they go by, you're like, why did I have that one right after this one? And then you're like, oh, if I trace that and I keep going with it, that led to this one. You work it backwards and you're like, that's why I'm fucked up. And it keeps you, because you're all of a sudden you're thinking from here. And you realize that whenever you're thinking from here, all you're really doing is trying to collect all those thoughts and you're looking at them really hard, and you're like, okay, what are you doing here? And I didn't invite you. And you're overthinking it. All of a sudden, you're just compiling more thoughts on top of those, stacking them up, and you think you're making progress. It's not getting you anywhere. You got to empty that cup out, And Rene Descartes, dude, he was before Kant and he was before Schopenhauer, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see a lot of that. I think it takes a certain level of what we now call mistakenly mental illness he realized the pineal gland, Rene Descartes, and whether he got it from ancient traditions, I know it's an old tradition, the pine cone, whether he got it from there or not doesn't matter to me. He was the one to really realize it and point it out as a literal thing. Before that, it was always just a symbol, and now you see that in Kant and you see that in Schopenhauer. And shamans were what we call mentally ill. And that's not a conspiracy theory. If you have autism today, you are going to get medications and special needs stuff or whatever, and they will do everything they can to suppress that autism so that they can cram you into the cube that we are familiar with. And what a nightmare for this person, right? Whereas in ancient times, if you had autism, and by the way, there's going to be maybe a dozen comments saying that autism is new or whatever. Pick your favorite mental thing, whatever it is, fill in the blank. If you have schizophrenia, whenever you're in ancient times, they celebrated it. This dude hears voices. Where are those voices coming from? Well, we're not going to try to define where the voices are coming from. It doesn't matter. So people will argue, it's like, oh, those voices are transmissions from the above worlds. And then somebody will be like, no, those voices are from their subconscious mind. This, ancient people didn't bother with negating those voices with a definition. They just knew they were coming from somewhere. And those two things might be the same. So they would be like, congratulations, you are a shaman. You don't get to make any rules because you're a little off, but we need you to go into the cave and make communion with those voices, whether it's bad or good, and bring those messages back to us because you think differently than the rest of us do. It's so incredibly necessary to have those people who think differently than we do, or else we're going to end up in an echo chamber, if I might risk using a buzzword, but that's exactly what it is if we all think the same, we have an echo chamber that we all agree on, and it's unhealthy. We need the conspiracy theorists, dude. Oh my goodness. If I could think of the one thing in society that is just so underappreciated, it is the whack job conspiracy theorist guy at your work or whatever, walking around. 90% of what he's saying is whack, and 10% of what he's saying is spot on. But we go and we throw away everything because he was wrong about this one thing, and all of a sudden, 5 years later, 2 years later, they try to induce the entire population, blah blah blah, whatever. Hey, fill in the blank, and we weren't prepared. Meanwhile, had you maybe spoken with that person that you considered to be mentally ill, you'll realize that they saw something that the rest of us didn't because they were a little bit off center. And man, it's a good thing. You and I have a little bit of that in us.
Absolutely. Okay, so you mentioned thoughts and like the identification with thoughts that gets us stuck in these loops and whatnot. And if you look to especially the East Asian traditions, especially like the Zen traditions, the whole shtick is about dissociating one's sense of selfhood from one's thought patterns, right? And so that's what the koans are about. They're all about getting you to back up and look at your own inner monologue in such a way that you can realize that you're not it. Um, which yeah, there's an immense power in that. But again, this is very illustrative of the way in which the human eye, the human self, is so malleable, how it can take in different parts and how it can eject certain things. It's this very nebulous kind of thing in a lot of ways. So there's this guy, his name is Julian Jaynes. He was a psychologist from I want to say Harvard or Princeton. Anyway, he has this book called The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, and it's fascinating. There's a bunch of stuff I don't agree with him about, but he spins this whole narrative together about Julian Jaynes. So Julian Jaynes. He's
Emerald.
the bicameral mind. Bicameral, I believe.
Wait,
Um,
yeah, this looks awesome.
anyway, but yeah, he's got this whole narrative where he's talking about how if you look to any kind of literature and stuff prior to the late Bronze Age, people don't talk about an inner monologue as though it's coming from a self. It's always spoken of as though it's the voices of the gods or the ancestors. You don't have this idea of like an inner monologue until at the very earliest, the late Bronze Age. And this is fascinating because this is the exact same process that I described before with like the perspectivity thing. We experience thoughts as happening to us, and then as the eye develops throughout this period of time, which is really Carl Jasper's axial age, there's this interiorization of that dialogue where now we feel like, oh, the voices in our heads are our voices, right? And we think that's normal and good and healthy, and it is. But that was not always the case. That was not normal at all. Not very long ago, historically. And what it illustrates here is this: every time the ego kind of envelops a new layer of our being, it kind of creates a barrier in a way. Prior to that interiorization of dialogue, um, these people were talking to the gods. They were talking to the ancestors. There was this receptivity there because there was this kind of vacant space that the ego had not swallowed up yet, basically, right? And that allowed them to do things that most of us can't do today, normally at least, not under normal circumstances. They were much more able to tune in to the dead specifically. That's a major one because, I mean, think about it. Like even, there's all kinds of stuff going on here I could talk about with like morphic resonance and stuff like that. But even just barring that for a minute, you're living in a tiny little settlement in the Neolithic area, Catalhoyuk or Jericho or some shit. You've got this continuous line of like maybe 500 people who have been living in the same place for like 3,000 years. Um, and there are thought forms, there are personality types that are being passed on generation to generation to generation, and they're in your head. And so if you don't have an ego where you feel like all of the dialogue going on is coming from you, then yeah, like it is coming from the ancestors. Where else would it come from, right? And they were able to tune into this kind of thing. But it goes even further than that, right? And I'm glad you mentioned conspiracy theories because this connects in here too, right? Because um we see this process also occurring within the human maturation process, the way that we develop throughout our lifetimes, right? Our egos develop in pretty much the exact same way. You start with basically no ego when you're in the womb. There is no distinction between me and the body of the mother. It's all just one thing. So there's no self-world distinction yet. Then once the child is born, their sense of self is localized within the body in this kind of like magical animistic way. Everything is about bodily feelings, hunger, and things like that, right? And then it moves up as the child gets to about 7 or 8 years old. They start to feel themselves to be their own personalities, like they're, oh, I like this, I don't like that, like that kind of thing. And so what's happening is it's moving through the subtle bodies. It's moving from the purely physical, which is interesting because at the purely physical level, that's the womb. That's where there is no distinction. And then it's the etheric, which is the life body. And then it's the astral, which is like the behavioral body. And then it becomes the mind around age like 14 or 15-ish. And so what's really crazy is what happens when this process gets fucked up in some kind of way. So there's this really nuts story of this girl. I forget her name. I'll look it up and leave it in the comments or whatever. But this was, I believe it was out in the Midwest somewhere. I forget the time period. This was the 20th century though, I believe. It was this girl and she had this like really messed up family and they were living on this like homestead type of thing. And they literally left her in this barn um to basically they treated her like one of their dogs. Okay, this is a crazy story. And like she grew up like that until like some stuff happened, and I think police got involved or whatever, and so she got rescued from that and grew up to live a normal life. But the crazy thing is, when she was a child, she thought she was actually an animal and acted like one. Yeah, I know,
Oh,
it's crazy.
those,
And
those archetypes.
mhm. And
Wow.
as she got older, like once she kind of got rehabilitated, she was able to live like a normal person and whatnot. And she didn't really talk about this to anybody because she was really embarrassed by it. She started dating this guy, and they start to get close or whatever, and she tells him about it. And he's like, "Can you show me that part of you?" And she did, and he freaked out and dumped her and stopped talking to her immediately because it scared him so much. Yeah, wild.
Let
It-
go. Human part. It just revert back like it was natural.
yeah, because it seems so unsettling, right? Because yeah, it's crazy.
Her whole
But
life is just pretending to be human.
mhm.
Oh, fuck.
But think about what this means, like what's actually going on here, right? At that level of her development, when she was like before the age of like, 7 years old or whatever, her ego had not incorporated into that astral part yet, like the behavioral part, right? And so she just tuned in to what the living things around her were doing, and those were literally dogs. And so that she was able to tune into that. And it shows that the human mind can do that. It can actually it's malleable. It's like a oh, what's a good example of this? Like like some kind of putty that can be molded into different shapes, right? And wherever the ego has not ingressed into yet, that's still malleable, that's still putty, that can still be reshaped in different ways. And this is exactly what shamanism is. I mean, if you ask the shamans, what are they doing? They're tuning into the animal spirits. That's literally what's going on here, because within that shamanic animistic mode of consciousness, it's the human ego is not in that layer yet. So that layer is still kind of vacant and available for that kind of shamanic practice to actually occur.
Yeah, that is absolutely wild, staggering, enlightening. It explains anthropomorphism and therianthropes.
Yeah.
And it's like there's a lot of people who, they jump the gun with these ancient astronaut theories and whatnot, saying, oh, they were human animal hybrids and the Anunnaki spliced the genome. And you're like, dude, no, if you get in the mind and you realize that there's an animal consciousness, there's plant consciousness within us still, in all these forms of consciousness, it's reflected in the artwork. And we are that. And not only are we are that, we can tap into it. And in this woman's case, she was so much that I guess all she had to do, she didn't have to pretend to be an animal.
He
She
just
just let go of her human act. And
mhm.
he, I guess it wasn't doggy style, but maybe that's what he was asking for. But but she showed some true colors and it freaked him out. I don't know how I would react, and it makes me curious about myself. How would I react to a woman who acts like an animal? There's probably a lot of guys out there who go, yeah, yeah. But man, that's so frightening. And to go back to what you were saying a bit before about the humans didn't necessarily see the world as an I, they saw the world as a we, so to speak. If there's anybody out there who like doubts that, dude, do yourself a favor and just look at some of the artwork that is from like back in the day. The way that they do artwork then and the way that we do now, it illustrates quite literally, uh, exactly what you're saying. That they didn't
Yeah.
see these things as an individual I. They were quite literally the environment. They saw themselves as the environment. the best example of that, I think, is like Zen artwork, where you almost have to like pinpoint where the subject, the Zen master, so to speak, the person is in the picture. Because a lot of these old paintings, the person involved that you would call like the individual is merged with the environment, and then it didn't take long for like these illustrations of the human body, even though in this case the body is defined and you can see it, even within it is astrological symbols that show that we are quite literally that. These ancient people considered themselves to be, I'm actually kind of looking for my favorite one that shows it perfectly. There's an Egyptian drawing, and they're drawing a scene, an everyday scene where they're harvesting crops or whatever. What is so fascinating about this drawing is how they depicted the trees. They did not care to define the trees the way that a human being sees the tree. They It's almost like they got it out of the way. Man, I'm not going to be able to find it in time, but um but basically it shows just these two lines coming up and they sprout out. It doesn't look anything like a tree. What in Mark Booth is who wrote this Secret History of the World, and he kind of walks you through the consciousness of man with illustrations, with these paintings, with these drawings, and the way they drew the world was subjective, purely subjective. And it took thousands of years before artists were actually saying, okay, look at the bark, look at the little knobs and the tree, and look at the way it protrudes, and then draw it exactly how it is. This ancient artwork looks like a dream. It looks like the person is dreaming. Go ahead.
But think about this. You said it was subjective, and then we started looking at the bark and the leaves and how it actually looks and whatnot. But it's actually kind of the opposite in a way. It's actually becoming more subjective over time, because what happens when we do art? You're never actually like recreating the object itself, right? Like if I was just trying to like show you the tree, I would just go and dig up the damn tree and bring it to you, right? Like I'm rendering what I am experiencing the essence of the tree to be. And so for the Egyptians, like, yeah, they weren't worried about how it looks to you. They were worried about what the fundamental archetype of the tree is. And we do this all the time with like cartoons, right? Like you just, boil it down to the basic characteristics that really are expressive of the personality of the character you're drawing. The Egyptians are doing the same damn thing. But once you move into through that Renaissance period, something changes, because then suddenly it matters how the tree actually looks when a person is looking at it. That the Egyptians didn't give a damn about that. But then suddenly we started caring about that a lot. And you see this emotion again, where the way the world is experienced from that first person subjective point of view starts to be taken as something fundamental, as something archetypal in itself. And you
Right.
see this in art history. I already talked about the Renaissance, but if we go further than that, we see the same process continuing over time. Rembrandt, for example. Rembrandt is known for creating. He's kind of considered to be an early impressionist,
Right.
and he's really known for what's known as Rembrandt Brown. So he used a lot of very earthy tones in his paintings. And
Just for people keep on
um
going on the people who might be wondering. But
yes.
yeah,
Yeah, so what he's doing, he's incorporating these more earthy tones, and there's something symbolic going on here. There's a
right.
motion towards the earth from the celestial realm that's happening. The Greeks, the medievals, did not think they were depicting like people or things in the world, really. They were trying to capture these eternal archetypes, the gods, the forms, right? And so they weren't worried about like how it looks from your perspective. But Rembrandt is and he's just one example of this. He's starting to really care about this kind of thing. And so for example, in some of his paintings, like it was very common at the time to do paintings of like a Madonna, right? Or Jesus or Mary Magdalene or whatever. He would depict these biblical figures because those were the primary archetypal figures of the time. But what he would do is he would take people that he knew in his personal life and use them as kind of a model for like, so he would paint, I'm just using a random example, this probably isn't true, but like he would paint like the Madonna, the Virgin Mary, like his wife or his sister or something like that. That was a thing he did. And so you're seeing the same process at work here where there's this kind of blending that's happening between the transcendental world and the immanent world of human subjective experience.
Right. And what you just described, actually, you're not wrong. Right here. Oh, where'd it go? So like he's painting these archetypal figures, but if you look at the expression on the face here, it's got a very sheer human expression that his wife might make, you know. And so I think he's using the emotional states and the way that we all feel from time to time, and then applying it to these archetypal figures. And then all of a sudden, he's merging those two things together, and all of a sudden, it's very relatable. I could see this artwork coming out for the first time and causing being a catalyst of change for artwork everywhere, you know?
Yeah, and
This
then
is
as you continue through it, like again, there's this whole progression here that's happening because then you're going to get to the actual impressionist and expressionist painters like Van Gogh, for example. Like within the Renaissance, the Leonardo da Vinci is painting the Mona Lisa as a person would appear to you visually if you were looking at them. The impressionists like Van Gogh are saying, okay, well, I'm not even worried about like the visual impression itself. I'm worried about like the emotional texture of that visual impression now. And so with Starry Night, you see this, right? Like you're not seeing the stars as they would be captured by a camera. You're seeing them as they impress upon the human soul, as it were. So again, you've got the same process iterating over time of us sinking deeper and deeper into our own inner caverns, as it were. It's like there's this space within us that's opening up over time. And that's laying the groundwork for the transformations that we'll be moving through, I believe, in the near future, actually.
yeah, and like it's like uh, which I'm not a fan, but I sort of get it now. And that's a hard distinction to make because when I was 14 years old, I enjoyed doing sketches and drawing and took pride in trying to be hyper realistic. And I would say things like, "Dude, Picasso sucks." That's what I would say. I'd be like, "That's it's garbage." You know, it looks like it looks like a child drew it. And I guess it kind of takes it takes maybe for me mushrooms to realize that not to the extreme, but to realize that he was painting a mood. He was painting a way of seeing the world that, in a weird way, is more accurate than taking a photograph. Because, I mean, a photograph is going to show us the physical, tangible world, whereas a painting by Picasso, who he's modern. That's like new. He's alive, but you know, surrealism. It causes us to see a subjective perspective of the world that we otherwise might not have seen before. And if we are trapped in this cave, in this solipsism, we won't appreciate that art. In fact, we won't even be able to appreciate that art. And that's what I I still struggle with. Like for example, when it comes to on the subject of art and painting, there's a painter named um it's trash. It just ain't no good at all. What's his I went on a rant. I'm doing the damn thing where I can't think of the name, and now the more I think about it,
Describe it. Describe it. I'll probably know it.
Kevin Pollak. I just realized. No, Kevin Pollak is a damn actor. Hold on.
Jackson Pollock is who you're thinking of.
He just flung paint at the damn whatever. And people bought it for $2 million. And I'm over here like, I'm working in the snow. I'm pissed, right? So, but people are like, you have to understand it's the motions and you have to see it from a abstract point of view. And I'm like, it's trash. Ain't no good, right? I'm dying on this hill, you know. But I tried. I tried to see it. I did learn a fun fact, by the way. Jackson Pollock's success was a CIA experiment to see if they could persuade people to think that something is good by giving it a high price tag. It's something that they learned from and they use to this day to persuade people. You know, if you've got two things and they're the same, but this one is significantly more expensive, a person will oftentimes even use this product and say, oh, with wine, this works with wine. They've done the study. They did over and over again. They do this, and I think it's a lot of fun. They give people 2 glasses of wine. One of them's cheap, one of them is expensive, and then they swap them. And the person who is an expert wine taster will say, this is why this wine is better. This is why this wine is more expensive. They have no idea that they swapped them. And that's placebo. But if it's not placebo, it just goes to show you that we're all kind of full of shit. We can be persuaded. We can be hypnotized, dude. There are things on television that people describe as good. And I can't force myself. There's a TV show, I don't watch it. So, you know, but there's a TV show called Survivor that used to be a thing back in the 90s or whatever. Yeah. It's basically the most awful shit that they could possibly put in a box and deliver it to you. Straight dog shit. People got sucked in, dude. People would watch this shit and they'd be into it. And it makes a person confused as to how they can sell something so absolutely awful and repugnant, and people will digest it. And as they're digesting it, it's becoming part of who they are. And this awful TV show is literally kind of molding and shaping society in a way. And on that note, being like the show Survivor is all about gossiping about other people in order to knock them down as far as possible. The further down they're knocked down, the higher up you become. It's an absolute fallacy. It doesn't work that way. Nothing does, right? It's this Darwinian type way of thinking, survival of the fittest. And we've proven time and time again through science and philosophy that harmony and relationship and conjunction is what the secret is to these things. But they put this show out there like Survivor, and then they follow it by the news, and then so you got this message from this garbage TV show, and then immediately the news tells you that if you walk outside, you might get shot, and your neighbor is out to kill you. And they're morphing and changing. I know right now I'm just diving into the conspiracy part of this, but it's a slippery slope. But it's an egregore. You can affect in the entire society through that one little TV show, and subjectively change the way that people see the world, the same as this artwork is. That this artwork occurs to us and it's new, and in this case, Rembrandt. You know, it literally, by painting, Rembrandt inadvertently changed the way that humans see the world through their eyes. And I almost feel like the powers that be study that, whether it be MK Ultra or any of these numerous whatever, you name your favorite, and then they apply that tactic to the television and they get in your head, they get under your skin, and all of a sudden you're paranoid and you're watching your back in ways that are unnecessary. One of my favorite examples of this is on a subway in New York City, a big yellow sign that says, if you see something, say something. That was the big phrase, right? And people bought it. That was the, if you see something, say something. Now all of a sudden they see that and they're on the subway. And now the last thing they're going to do is talk to the person next to them. Instead of talking to them, they're analyzing them at a side eye so that they don't notice that they're analyzing them. And if their backpack is a little weird right there in the middle and bulbous, they're like, okay, I've been trained to know that that's not normal. And although it's a very, very skim statistic that this might be dangerous, I'm going to call the police because that sign right there gave me permission to say that you're a bad guy because of the color of your skin, because of your backpack being slightly different than mine, because of any randomized difference between me and this person. All of a sudden, I've got permission on a big yellow sign that instead of embracing those differences and, I mean, cliche, say, make the world a better place, I'm picking those little differences apart so that we can become enemies. That way, I can reduce you to ashes and become a hero. I'm a virtuous person now because I knocked you down, and thus now I am up. I'm high now in a superior. Even if you did nothing wrong, I still called the police because the sign says to do that, and that makes me a good person. It's fucking poisonous, dude. But I know I just turned what you were saying into a total unhinged conspiracy thing, but that's where it took me. And it's absolutely the case. The art reflects it. I wish that people would take the time to go back in time and read the old books, read the old philosophy, and maybe get to a point that they realize that we are kind of being manipulated, you know?
Yeah, there's this really fascinating documentary by this guy, this director named Adam Curtis. It's called Century of the Self. I believe he did a few documentaries. I'm pretty sure that's the one I'm thinking of. But anyway, it's about Anna Freud, who was it was Sigmund Freud's niece, I believe. Anyway, she took psychoanalysis and basically turned it into marketing psychology in the United States, and then the CIA found out about it, and then it turned into this whole thing during the post-war period of using psychology to weaponize propaganda in these very surgical ways, like what you described. If you see something, say something, right? Because then at that point, you've created what Michel Foucault would have called a panopticon. You don't actually even need anyone to actually say anything. You just need the people to think that someone else might say something if they see something, right? And then you've created the big brother, the all-seeing eye, right? And it turns out there is no all-seeing eye because there doesn't have to be, because now you're monitoring yourself because you're afraid someone else might be. And that's exactly how it works. I mean, this literally goes back. This was an idea developed initially by Jeremy Bentham, who was this British utilitarian philosopher, and he developed this idea for a prison. And I don't think one was ever built like this, but it was like a ring, and there was like a courtyard, and so all the cells were facing into this courtyard, and in the middle of it there was going to be a tower. And the idea is that there would be, like, I guess some curtains or mirrors set up or something in the tower so that there could be a guard in the tower that could see into any of the cells. And the idea here would be that the prisoners in those cells would never actually know whether they were being watched or not. And ultimately what would happen here is you would not actually need to have a guard in that tower anymore because it wouldn't even matter. They would monitor themselves. because
Wow.
just of the possibility that they might be being watched. And so, yeah, that kind of psychology goes all the way back to the origins of this kind of like proto-industrial world that would eventually become modernity. And yeah, it's dystopian as fuck, man. And now we're living in a world where that kind of thing is being used in even more surgical ways with the algorithms and things like that. I mean, I know lots of people have talked about this, but it still blows my mind. I mean, I can just like casually talk about like cat food. I don't own a cat. And then next thing you know, like my phone is going to be trying to sell me cat food. And I
Right.
mean, this happens all the time. Like I'll like, uh, I mean, I could give more examples of this, but anyway, it's like the way in which social engineering has become a science in itself is kind of horrifying. And then, like on the back of that, you've got data brokering, which is a whole thing now. There are no laws regarding that at all. Like theoretically, you can ask these companies to delete your data, but like which companies have your data? Who knows? How are you going to know whether they actually delete it or not? Like, I mean, it's complete Wild West right now. And of course, whenever there's any kind of loopholes or gray area of any kind, then the powers that be are going to be using that to their advantage, whether it's, selling more skadoodles or getting people to go die in wars. It doesn't matter to them. It's about mobilizing human bodies to achieve certain results. That's really the name of the game.
It's fascinating, dude. And so 2 points on what you just said there. Um, anyone who this tower in the middle of the jail where people, it doesn't matter if there's a guard, they feel like they're being watched, so they control themselves. This ain't new. If you look at the Catholic Church bent the idea of God into exactly that, a man in the clouds. There's a word for it. And it's not anthropomorphism. There's a word for it, right? It's an illusion, right? The Catholic Church turned God into Big Brother by making it a guy who is always watching you 100% of the time, and all of a sudden people are, yeah, kind of going insane, and that leads directly to atheism. By the way, because
Oh yeah.
if you can't deal with that, which most people can't. I couldn't. That I'm always being watched by a personified figure, a father. Oh, it's not pleasant. It always reminds me of like I gave a eulogy at one of my buddy's funerals, and it was the eulogy he would have wanted, and I'll just get that out of the way. His family was there, and there was preachers there, but I made the joke. I said, at these things, everyone at some point always says that, you know what, Charles is up there right now looking down on us, and he'll be keeping an eye on us. And that makes it incredibly difficult for me to masturbate. And got that
I'm
from
glad that I was allowed to just think it and that you could say that. Thank you. I appreciate that. Carry on.
mom to me, gave me a hug, and she was like, "That is exactly what my son would have said," and it was fun, there are some people, but that's the idea of everybody when they run out of options, or say maybe they want to control people, they resort to the easiest personification of something that is now invisible. They make it a man in the sky looking down, and it is the most narrow and weirdly specific way to look at anything, because you're assuming that this thing is now you doing what you would be doing if you were in that position. But we have to realize that our brain is like 3 pounds of jello. We are not going to be able to, as Alan Watts said, taste our own tongue when it comes to knowing what we are. Whenever a person leaves the body, they're not in a cloud looking down. there's consciousness there for sure. And this is the oldest of the ancient traditions, you know, but there's no way we're going to be able to comprehend how it is looking at us, if at all. And the same needs to be realized by scientists about this personification of a God figure, because let's look at the Big Bang, right? I'm not a big fan. In the Big Bang Theory, which is the established thing, two things happen: the emergence of matter out of nothingness. First of all, miracle. And then that matter, that dead matter, all of a sudden woke up and became online. Miracle number two, right? So you this staunch theory that scientists hold so proud is literally miracle after miracle. Whereas the idea of mind before matter that they're so railed against, that the ancient tradition maintains, is that mind was first, and then the thoughts of that mind became so entwined and dense that it appears to us as physical matter. All of a sudden, it's like dreaming of reality, right? Like the Brahma. All of a sudden, you don't need miracles anymore. That explanation is void. It takes 100% less miraculous happening for that to be the case than what the scientists are pushing. But unfortunately, it requires a job, and they can't have that. They
It's
won't.
what
You
it
know.
is. It's a very convenient way of seemingly sucking the magic out of the world, because what's actually happening with the Big Bang cosmology, and especially the way that the notion of like entropy and the heat death of the universe, the way these things lock together, you can really start to see what's going on here. The things that science would need to explain in the world are the opposite of entropy. It's order that needs to be explained. But with that Big Bang cosmology, what ends up happening is you have all of the order, all the negative entropy or centropy is contained there all at once within the Big Bang. And then after the explosion happens, it's all just kind of winding down from there. Right. So what's happening here is basically science is taking everything that it should be explaining and packing it all into its one free miracle so that it doesn't really have to explain anything. And so what happens is you end up with a world where it's like, oh, there are no miracles. We can explain it all with the Big Bang, but then the Big Bang is, it's like all the miraculousness is just contained in that one little thing that you can more easily sweep under the rug. Now you were
Yeah.
talking about the Sky Daddy type of way of conceptualizing God. Another thing here that's kind of connects with what we were saying about social engineering, um, is that it actually creates this kind of trauma enactment feedback loop, right? So for example, people from well, let me say it this way: alcoholism tends to travel genealogically, and it's not genetics. What it is it's that children raised within alcoholic homes see their parents using that as a release valve. And what happens as children is they start justifying the bad behaviors as because children cannot, like, they think of their parents as basically gods. It's not really possible for a child to conceptualize their parents as actually being flawed. So what happens is they start seeing that kind of behavior as a kind of acceptable release valve. And so they get stressed out later on when they're teenagers or adults. And what's the first thing they want to do is drink. You would think it would be the opposite of that because they went through all this traumatic shit as children with their alcoholic parents. But no, it actually has the opposite effect, specifically because it's conditioned them to think of that as a release, as a way of dealing with problematic things like stress or anxiety or whatever. And you see the same thing with well, with all kinds of things. You see this with like sexual trauma. This is, I probably shouldn't be talking about this on YouTube, but it is, there's this weird kind of irony to it, but this is a very real thing that people who have undergone sexual abuse tend to, sometimes at least, tend to be more sexual, not less sexual, which you would think it would be the opposite. But again, there's this kind of trauma reenactment thing that happens where people want to relive the traumatizing things they've been through because it gives them a way of like taking control of those things that happen to them, right? And so anyway, plug this into this whole sky daddy thing, right? You tell kids or teenagers, whatever, that there's this juridical, judgmental, invisible asshole in the sky watching everything they do. And they start to associate that with power, with what it is to be in control, what it is to have certainty and to be at the top of the world. You know what I mean? And so then those kids, go and get jobs and climb the corporate ladder, and then they're sitting behind the desk. And what are they going to do? They're going to embody that exact same archetype because in their mind, that's what it is to be at the top, right? And so you just create this loop that way.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. It's if you ask me, about the alcoholism, it's not just that they adopt the alcoholism, it's that they adopt the trauma that causes the alcoholism. What I think a lot of people need to realize is that it is possible to look at it as if they're reenacting what they've already seen as an example. But I don't think that's the most helpful way to understand alcoholism as a real disease. What people need to realize is that that is that person's 12 o'clock noon position. That's who they are already in their core. They didn't see that. This is my boy Emery. It's my co-star. It's my hecklefish right here. They don't. What I think a lot of people don't realize when they say alcoholism is not a disease, right? Drug addiction is not a disease. It's a choice. Bullshit. That person was grown in that household. Their noon position of their pendulum is quite literally that. In order to shed that programming is an enormous effort. And it takes such of, dare I say, spiritual alchemy, but there's a lot of other words, other ways to put that psychologically. But that's who they are. That's their core. That's their seed. You can't plant a seed, an apple seed in the ground, and then bitch when it doesn't grow up as oranges. That's what that seed absolutely 100% is. And in fact, also on that notion, what I want a lot of people to know, and maybe spread this out in the world a little bit the best I can, play my little part, is to also realize that when it comes to drug addiction, it's not always a choice. People didn't turn 14, 15 years old and then decide to use a drug or to do something incredibly dangerous. Their parents, oftentimes, who were drug addicts, induced them with the drugs to get them to go to sleep, to get them to pay attention, to get them to behave themselves, to make them docile in this instance so they can do something incredibly wrong. A lot of, and by the way, babies are born sometimes into withdrawals. This is what needs to be. What happened? Oh, did I cut out for a second?
No, you're good.
Oh, my battery's at 20%. It's cool. But sometimes babies are born into the world with withdrawals. They will, for the rest of their life, be craving something, even if they never touch an opiate in their life. It doesn't matter. They're going to crave something and it's going to be missing within them forever. That's just who they are now. They don't have a choice. They can't fill that void with nachos, with entertainment, with shopping, with opiates. It will be a void forever because they were born that way. And I wish people had a little bit more empathy in that direction. And I always encourage people to look at it like food and water. Whenever someone says, why don't you, it's a choice. Why don't you just not do it? You got to ask that person, okay, then I want you to fast for 3 days. and tell me, how you feel. By the way, it's incredibly healthy to fast, the same way as it is to stop using something, right? Both are the same though, and that's what the point is. That's what's important, is to for a person to realize how difficult it is for an addict, even a one who's never touched a drug. They need to realize that it's the same difficulty as not touching food for 3 days. And in the case of an alcoholic, it's like not touching food in the middle of a Chili's, because you're surrounded by food constantly. If you're in Missouri, in St. Louis, for example, you can't walk through a gas station to go get a coconut water without passing the alcohol aisle. It's torture for alcoholics. And there's a reason, by the way, that's the one that's chosen to be legal, but we all know that story and I don't need to get into it, but that's what's up, buddy?
What time to go to half price book?
We are going to Half Price Books today, and he's excited about it, which I tricked him into being excited about it.
Yeah, because he's gonna give me a game for my Game Boy.
Half Price Books has a bunch of old school video games.
Hey, they're not old school, they're cool.
Oh, it's old school.
No, it's not.
But yeah, we're gonna give him a Game Boy and a Pokemon game or whatever, and we're gonna go.
I wasted so much of my life on the Pokemon Game Boy games when I was a kid. It is absurd. Those were the best.
Right from us is a little Pokemon store.
Pokenerd?
Pokenerd. And
hey, if you're near a Pokenerd, go there and get something.
That's good advice, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
are you making a video, by the way?
We are recording, but it's not. So we can cut whatever. But we will go up to Pokenerds on Friday nights, and they got a bunch of other kids, and you can kind of watch the other. Trade. You can watch the kids trade and compete and stuff like that.
But I have to buy some things because the only thing they're interested in is my Charizard.
Of course, if you got to buy something to have fun, but that's the trade that gets made or whatever.
Yeah, I have a Charizard that was $50, and it turns out it's $150 online.
Yeah. So speaking of, Century of Self is a book. Yeah. It looks like
it's a documentary as well. It's a very well made documentary. Yeah.
We gotta watch the documentary. I want to get the book too. This looks absolutely fascinating. So Freud wasn't necessarily responsible for this whole thing. It was in his wake.
Yeah, I don't believe Freud himself, Sigmund Freud, was directly related to any of this, but it was I believe it was his niece, if I'm not mistaken, but Anna Freud was her name, a relative of Sigmund Freud. She's the one who came to America and got involved with the corporate world and started using psychoanalysis for corporate marketing purposes, and then that started to bleed into the deep state intelligence and CIA and all that jazz. So yeah.
It's showing here women smoking was it was seen as rebellious for women to be smoking, but the trend was set by cigarette companies.
Yeah, so basically what happened, like cigarette companies, like so Anna Freud basically created this whole like marketing business. And she would go to she would go to companies like that, and they would basically ask her, hey, how do we open up to get more people to do whatever it is we're selling? And so this is one example of that. She was like, because she had seen like what had happened after the World Wars. Women had entered the workplace. They were all about being independent and all that. And she was just like, associate the cigarettes with that. Simple as that. Put up a billboard of a woman on her lunch break smoking a cigarette. She's working. She's independent. She's pulling her own weight. American women love that kind of thing. And it worked. And that's just one example among, there are probably examples we'll never even hear about because it's going to be buried in corporate archives until the end of time. But yeah, there's a lot of that.
Unless you can spot it, dude. One thing I recommend is, hopefully I can find this real quick. I got a book called, here it is, Mind Programming. And this book literally trains the reader how to spot advertising manipulation. And the way you just described that as just associated with independence. It's so easy for them to do, but that means it's also easy for us to fall into. But that also leads way to subliminal advertising. So check this out, dude. I recommend that. Yes, thank you, son. Oh my God. All right. So okay. I know this is going to be difficult to see, but if you look at this woman, or not this woman, just if you look at her drink, it's just a drink, right? No big deal. She's having a drink, and I kind of want to drink now too, right? This guy traced the outline of the ice cubes. So this is the ice cubes that are with the lines traced around the hard edges. And then you get rid of the ice cubes and just look at the lines that he traced around them, and it's an orgy. And there's no question about it. So something about seeing that unconsciously is causing a rift. And you think, okay, it's not innocent, but at the same time, they're not really harming anybody, right? They're just persuading you to buy a product. It gets worse. So, like, for example, there is a cigarette ad right here, and you've got a couple, and they're enjoying cigarettes together, right? That's enough to make somebody, who's not aware of self, to kind of want a cigarette because they want to have a girlfriend, whatever. He breaks it down again. If you look at some of the lines between what's going on here, you start to realize that he's a devil, right? The hand gestures are of violent figures, of like intestines, and it's hard. It's basically hard on the psyche. It's got like spiders, snakes, all this shit that we are primordially afraid of is in the artwork. So what he's doing is, in this case, not using sexual imagery to sell something to persuade you, but in this case, you're damaging the person's subconscious mind and you're hurting them. And when they are in pain, they feel like they need something to alleviate that pain. And what are cigarettes known to do? So these advertisers went through, and I wonder if this stems from this century of self, this Freud thing, because it doesn't mention it in the book that I have seen, but he even breaks down how the brain ends up, how it sees those subliminals and is affected by it. Hey, there's probably subliminals.
I had one of those. I had the one with the transparent case as well. Yeah. I love those things.
Problem is, it doesn't have a back.
I would say that I would get one, but then I'll never make another Formscapes video again. I'll be too busy playing Pokemon. So I'm gonna avoid that.
Pokemon every single day.
Psychology of Game Boy by Formscapes, dude. I could see it.
I played Pokemon Field and beat it in one day.
One day.
Yeah. And got all my Pokemon to level 100 and got a couple legendaries.
You're just bragging at this point.
I just want to get a shiny Pokemon. I haven't gotten one yet.
Well, I recommend this unit to anybody, and it helps. This kind of helps a person understand themselves too. But you'll never walk through the mall the same way after browsing this puppy. You don't even got to read it cover to cover. You just see the examples.
You ready to go?
No, we're gonna finish here.
No, you can bring it.
Oh my God.
So I actually need to go ahead and hop off of here, but that was great. Love chatting with you, man. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry, what is the little one's name? Sam. Okay, cool. Nice to meet you as well. All right. Well, anyway, I'm gonna hop off of here, and yeah, I'll send you the recording and whatnot. And oh yeah, I'm supposed to do the like post video thing, like and subscribe, blah blah blah. Anyway, thanks for watching. All right.